Chapter 6. The Financialization of the Four Walls. How Canadian homes became global financial instruments. The house is the largest purchase most people will ever make. It is also, for many Canadians born after 1985, the purchase they will never make. A tale of two buyers. In 2003, a 28-year-old warehouse supervisor named Dan Kowalczyk bought a semi-detached house in Oshawa, Ontario. The price was $187,000. Dan's annual salary was $52,000. He needed a down payment of $9,350, 5%, and his monthly mortgage payment, at the interest rates of the day, came to roughly $950. He could cover it. He stretched, but he could cover it. In 2023, a 28-year-old warehouse supervisor named Jordan, Dan's nephew, same job, adjusted for inflation, earned $68,000 a year. The average semi-detached in Oshawa, Ontario, was listed at $780,000. The minimum down payment on a home at that price was $53,000. Jordan's entire take-home pay for the year, after taxes, came to approximately $51,000. The down payment alone exceeded his annual income. The monthly mortgage payment, at current rates, would have been roughly $4,200, more than 70% of his gross monthly earnings. The job hadn't changed. The neighborhood hadn't changed. The work ethic certainly hadn't changed. What changed was the nature of the asset Jordan was trying to buy. Dan bought a home. Jordan is trying to buy a financial instrument that used to be a home. Those are not the same transaction. This chapter is about that transformation, how it happened, who designed it, who profited from it, and why the familiar explanations we reach for describe symptoms while carefully avoiding the diagnosis. Beyond supply and demand, the convenient explanation. The supply and demand narrative is the official story of the Canadian housing crisis, and it is not false. It is incomplete in ways that happen to be politically convenient for those who benefit from the current system. The argument runs as follows. Canada's cities, especially Toronto and Vancouver, have not built enough homes to accommodate population growth. Restrictive zoning, neighborhood opposition, slow approvals, and construction costs have conspired to create a structural shortage. The solution, therefore, is to build more supply. Free the market. Remove the obstacles. The problem will correct itself. There is truth in this. Zoning restrictions are real. NIMBYism is real. Construction timelines in Canadian cities are genuinely punishing. But the supply narrative has a problem. It cannot explain what we actually observe. Between 2015 and 2023, Canada experienced one of the largest sustained housing construction booms in its history. Cranes dominated the skylines of Toronto and Vancouver. Condo towers rose in corridors that had been parking lots a decade before. Housing starts reached record highs in multiple years. Supply increased substantially and measurably. Prices did not fall. In most markets, prices continued to accelerate. The gap between prediction and reality is not an anomaly. It is evidence that a different mechanism is driving prices. The supply narrative cannot explain these divergences because it is analyzing only one side of a market that has been structurally altered. It focuses on homes as units of shelter while ignoring their transformation into units of investment. The rise of the REIT. When housing became a portfolio, a real estate investment trust, a REIT, is a corporation that owns, operates, or finances income-producing real estate. REITs trade on stock exchanges like any other public company. They are required by law to distribute at least 90% of their taxable income to unit holders as distributions. 10. In exchange for this distribution requirement, they receive significant tax advantages that ordinary landlords do not. REITs were introduced in the United States in 1960 as a mechanism for small investors to participate in large-scale real estate without having to buy property directly. Canada adopted similar legislation in 1994. For roughly a decade, Canadian REITs operated primarily in commercial real estate. Shopping malls, office towers, industrial warehouses. Residential housing remained largely outside the REIT model. That changed in the mid-2000s and accelerated dramatically after 2010. Following the 2008 financial crisis, central banks across the developed world drove interest rates to historic lows and held them there for over a decade. Government bonds, once capable of returning 4 or 5% annually, now returned less than 1%. Pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds, institutions managing trillions of dollars on behalf of millions of beneficiaries, faced a yield crisis. Residential real estate, which had historically been considered a retail rather than an institutional asset class, suddenly looked different. Here was an asset that could generate consistent yields of 4 to 8% annually through rental income, while also appreciating in value. For institutions desperate for yield, Canadian residential real estate was, in the language of portfolio management, a solution. The policy architecture Canadian government policy, at both the federal and provincial levels, actively facilitated this transformation. In some cases deliberately, in others through failures to foresee consequences, and in some through a studied incuriosity about outcomes that were politically difficult to acknowledge. The mortgage insurance system administered by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, was designed to help individual Canadians access home ownership by insuring high-ratio mortgages. Over time, the program's interaction with low interest rates produced a different effect. It guaranteed the floor beneath rising asset prices, reducing risk for lenders and investors alike. When housing is backed by a government mortgage insurer, it carries an implicit sovereign guarantee. That is not a small thing in institutional portfolio management. Capital gains tax treatment on investment properties remained among the most favorable in the developed world. Unlike income, which is taxed at full marginal rates, capital gains on real estate held through corporate structures were taxed at significantly preferential rates. Each dollar earned by a worker through wages was taxed more heavily than each dollar earned by an investor through property appreciation. This was not an accident of the tax code. It was a deliberate design choice, and it was repeatedly defended and preserved by governments of both major parties. The 2019 federal budget introduced measures specifically expanding the role of REIT in residential housing, including exemptions from withholding tax on distributions to foreign investors. The stated rationale was encouraging purpose-built rental construction. The practical effect was to make Canadian residential real estate more accessible and more attractive to international institutional capital. When a government insures the floor beneath an asset and then taxes returns from that asset at lower rates than wages, it has made a choice about whose income it values more. The mechanics of leverage. Why income can never win. Jordan approaches a home purchase with the savings he has accumulated from his after-tax income. Constrained by his debt service ratios, limited by mortgage stress tests, and bounded by the absolute ceiling of what he can sustain monthly from a $68,000 salary. A REIT, an institutional investor, or a highly leveraged individual investor, approaches the same purchase differently. They are not buying a home. They are acquiring an income-producing asset using borrowed capital to amplify returns. Their capacity to pay is not constrained by their income in the way Jordan's is. It is constrained by the expected rental yield of the property relative to their cost of borrowing. A completely different calculation. Jordan's maximum mortgage under the stress test, approximately $350,000. The institutional investor's justified purchase price for the same property, based on a 4.5% cap rate on $2,800 per month in rent, $747,000. The investor wins not because they are wealthier, but because they are playing a different game entirely. This is the crux of what the supply narrative misses. You can build 100,000 new homes in Toronto. If the expected rental yield on those homes makes them attractive as financial instruments at a price that Jordan cannot afford as a shelter, institutional capital will price him out of those homes too. Supply solves a shelter problem. It does not solve a financialization problem. Those require different interventions. The rent-or-own trap. The consequence of this dynamic is a trap that operates at the level of whole generations. Because Jordan cannot buy, he rents. Because he rents, he does not build equity. Because he does not build equity, his down payment does not grow at the rate his target property appreciates. The gap widens every year, that he remains a renter. Meanwhile, the investor who outbid Jordan for the property raises Jordan's rent by 8% to match market conditions. Jordan's wages rise by 3%. Each year, his residual savings capacity, the money he might have put toward a future down payment, shrinks. The mathematical logic of the trap is not subtle. It is ruthless. The housing market no longer asks, "Can this person afford to live here?" It asks, "What is the maximum this asset can extract from whoever needs to be near it?" Jordan does not experience this as policy. He experiences it as personal failure. He works harder, he spends less. He moves further from the city, taking on longer commutes that cost him time and money. He is told he is making poor financial decisions. Too many avocados, too much streaming. The structural machinery that is extracting from him at every turn remains politely off-screen. Putting a face on the abstract. Between 2010 and 2023, Canada's largest residential REITs, Canadian Apartment Properties REIT, Capriati, Boardwalk, and Killam Apartment, systematically acquired existing affordable rental stock, particularly in mid-sized cities where prices were lower and yields therefore more attractive. Cap rate alone grew from approximately 24,000 units following its 2004 acquisition of Residential Equities REIT to over 67,000 units by 2022. The acquisition pattern was not random. REITs systematically targeted naturally occurring affordable housing. Older apartment buildings with below-market rents, occupied by lower and middle-income tenants. Upon acquisition, these buildings were renovated, rents were raised to market levels, and tenants who could not absorb the increases were displaced. The units did not disappear from the housing stock. They became financially optimal, which is a different thing from socially useful. The platform-enabled conversion of long-term rental units to short-term vacation rentals represented a second mechanism of financialization, one that required no institutional actor and no particular capital sophistication. A single landlord with 2 or 3 properties could, using Airbnb or VRBO, earn 2 to 3 times the long-term rental yield from the same unit. Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver all saw significant conversion of rental stock to short-term use through the mid-2000s before regulatory responses were mounted. Responses that were, in several cases, partially rolled back following lobbying by platform operators and property owners. Perhaps the most structurally distorting element of Canadian housing financialization has been the pre-construction condominium market. Developers in Toronto and Vancouver learned that they could sell units in buildings that did not yet exist to investors seeking capital gains. These investors had no intention of occupying the units. They would assign their purchase contracts prior to closing, a transaction that was, for many years, subject to no land transfer tax and minimal capital gains exposure. The result was that new condominium construction came to be driven not by the shelter needs of the people who would eventually live in those buildings, but by the investment calculus of buyers who would never live in them. Units were designed for investability rather than habitability. The buildings rose. The housing crisis deepened. Guided drift, housing edition. No single decision created the housing crisis. No cabinet meeting in 1994 resolved that homes should be converted into financial instruments. What happened instead was a sequence of individually defensible decisions, each responding to a real problem, each with an identifiable constituency of support, each contributing incrementally to a structural outcome that was visible in its direction long before it became the emergency it is today. The CMHC mortgage insurance expansion lowered barriers to homeownership, a genuine good. It also backstopped the floor beneath asset prices, reducing the risk that would have naturally constrained speculative investment. The capital gains preferences on real estate investment supported the development of new rental stock, a genuine good. They also systematically rewarded the accumulation of housing assets over the accumulation of labor income. The REIT enabling legislation encouraged institutional investment in purpose-built rental housing, a genuine good. It also opened the door to the wholesale financialization of existing affordable stock. At each step, the policy served the stated interest while also serving, more durably, the unstated interest of those for whom housing was not primarily shelter, but primarily capital. Markets do not spontaneously decide that shelter should generate passive returns for investors. Policy decides that through what it taxes, what it subsidizes, and what it quietly permits. Markets do not spontaneously decide that shelter should generate passive returns for investors. Policy decides that through what it taxes, what it subsidizes, what it permits, and what it chooses not to see. What reform would actually require? The conventional reform agenda for Canadian housing, more supply, faster approvals, densification, inclusionary zoning, addresses the shelter dimension of the crisis. These are not wrong. They are necessary, but insufficient. They do not address the financialization dimension, which operates independently of supply and will continue operating independently regardless of how many units are built. Addressing financialization requires confronting a different set of questions. Whether tax policy should continue to privilege returns on capital assets over returns on labor, or whether the explicit decision to tax capital gains at preferential rates relative to employment income reflects a value judgment about whose economic contribution matters more that Canadians actually endorse. Whether a CMHC, whose mission is to promote housing affordability for Canadians, should continue backstopping an asset market that has become structurally unaffordable for a growing share of those Canadians. whether the conversion of naturally occurring affordable housing to financially optimized holdings is a market activity that public policy should be neutral about, or whether the public interest in stable, affordable housing stock is sufficient justification for regulatory intervention. It requires, in short, the same question this book returns to repeatedly. Who is the economy for? A housing market that functions perfectly for investors while failing. Entirely for workers is not a broken system. It is a system working exactly as its policy architecture designed it to work. The house and the contract. The housing crisis is perhaps the most direct expression of what the current absence of a social contract means in practice. The ability to secure stable housing, to have a place that is yours, that cannot be taken from you at the whim of a distant institutional landlord, that provides the physical and psychological security from which a life can be built, is foundational to participation in a shared society. It is not a luxury. It is the prerequisite for almost everything else. Stable employment, family formation, community engagement, civic participation, mental and physical health. When housing is transformed from a right of participation into an investment instrument, the implicit contract is broken. The young worker who cannot afford to live in the city where they work is not being offered a different kind of social contract. They are being excluded from the contract entirely. They are the weak. The market is doing what markets do in the absence of countervailing public will. The strong are doing what they can. The question before Canadians is not whether this outcome is theoretically possible in a market economy. Obviously, it is. The question is whether it is acceptable, and if it is not, what we are prepared to ask of those who have benefited from the current arrangement in order to change it. That is the conversation we must be willing to have, not around the edges. At the center, the shadow rental market. If the REIT represents the institutional face of the housing crisis, the large-scale, publicly traded, formally structured end of the market, there is another face that is smaller, more local, and for many Canadians, more immediately visible. It is the product of the same structural forces operating through individual investors rather than institutional ones, and it has produced consequences that the official housing conversation has been slow to name honestly. Since 2015, Canada has admitted over 1 million international students, the overwhelming majority of whom arrived in communities that had no meaningful plan for housing them. This was not primarily an immigration policy. It was a revenue policy. As provincial governments froze domestic tuition rates, post-secondary institutions, particularly colleges, expanded international student enrollment aggressively. International students paid 3 to 4 times the domestic tuition rate. They provided the revenue that kept institutions solvent without requiring governments to increase public funding. The students themselves were, in the bluntest terms, a financial product. What was not addressed was where these students would live. The answer, in many communities, was wherever they could afford, which meant wherever investors were willing to house them. The arithmetic of this arrangement is worth examining plainly. An investor purchases a $1.1 million suburban home in a city like Brampton or Mississauga. The monthly mortgage, at current rates, runs to approximately $7,000. No single family can afford that rent. And the stress test that would apply to a family purchase doesn't apply to an investor who intends to rent the property out. So the investor divides the house. Bedrooms become individual rental units, sometimes with a basement added to the configuration. 10 beds rented at $800 each. Monthly income, $8,000. The mortgage is covered. Equity is accumulating. The city's occupancy bylaws, if enforced, would shut the arrangement down immediately. They are largely not enforced. The students living in these arrangements are not experiencing Canadian hospitality. They are experiencing a form of extraction that depends on their vulnerability, their distance from family, their unfamiliarity with tenant rights, their precarious immigration status, and their reasonable fear that challenging their housing situation could jeopardize everything else. The basement bedroom that rents for $800 a month is not a rental unit. It is a financial instrument, just like the house it sits in. Meanwhile, the families, the Jordans of every neighborhood, who might have rented that property as a whole or might have purchased it as a home, find themselves priced out by an investor yield calculation that treats the building as something other than a place to live. The shadow rental market does not create housing. It extracts from the housing that exists, concentrating returns upward and costs downward. The mechanism is the same one operating everywhere else in this book. Active pressure producing a passive-looking result. No single decision created this market. But the combination of tuition policy, occupancy enforcement, zoning rules, and tax treatment created the conditions in which it thrives. The institutions that could address it, municipalities that could enforce bylaw compliance, provinces that could limit investor concentration, the federal government that set the immigration policy, have chosen, each for their own reasons, to look away. The blueprint, reclaiming the four walls. The conventional reform agenda for Canadian housing, more supply, faster approvals, densification, inclusionary zoning, addresses the shelter dimension of the crisis. These reforms are not wrong. They are necessary but insufficient because they do not address the financialization dimension, which operates independently of supply and will continue operating independently regardless of how many units are built. You can build 100,000 new homes in a city. If the expected yield on those homes makes them attractive to investors at a price that working families cannot afford for shelter, institutional capital will absorb them before the families arrive. Addressing the financialization of housing requires confronting a different set of questions. Not technical questions, political ones. Whether corporate entities that own residential housing as financial portfolios should continue to pay zero corporate income tax on distributions to shareholders, or whether that structural advantage represents a policy choice that the public has neither examined nor endorsed. Whether communities and tenants whose homes are sold to institutional investors should have any recourse. Whether a right of first refusal, giving tenants and community land trusts the opportunity to purchase at market value before a building enters an investment portfolio, would be a meaningful protection of the housing stock. Whether the banks and financial institutions that allocate capital should continue to do so primarily toward existing asset speculation. Mortgages that inflate prices on existing homes rather than toward new construction that actually adds to supply. A housing market that works perfectly for investors while failing entirely for workers is not a broken system. It is a system working exactly as its policy architecture designed it to work. The question is not whether it can be changed. It can. The question is whether we are willing to acknowledge clearly what would need to change, and who would resist the changing of it.